So another thing that happens is if things are too good, you get lazy and, you complain about stuff. So there's like a sort of a sweet spot in life. This is this resilience thing where, it's something that you can manage. If it's too difficult, you're eventually going to fold. And if it's too easy, you complain.
Here we go!
Welcome to In the Mental, a podcast for open, honest conversations about men's mental health. On today's episode, we're chatting with David Holt about the challenges and fatigue that come from being a caregiver. David, what's been going on the past few years?
So I'm going to start by talking about the good stuff. Moved to the shore of the Bay of Fundy about a year ago. We get harassed by eagles and foxes, and the tide comes and goes, and I go for kayak rides and I swim. The water's really cold. When we look, straight out, we see a big island in the middle of the bay, and we don't see any houses, and we have a long driveway, and it's all about nature. And the old family house, my wife's family house, we did just-in-time winterizing. But when those eagles squawk and chase each other around, it's real loud and real noisy. So, we got to complain about that. I've got, two great children in their 30s. One lives in Taiwan, jazz guitarist. My daughter's an executive in Halifax, and so we have two little grandchildren with my daughter. So, there's just like a lot of good stuff going on. That's where I want to start.
Okay, and but it wasn't always so good.
And at the same time, the last few years, I've had COVID twice, even though I got all the shots and boosters, just, they wear off after a while. Got COVID twice, Lyme disease at least once, re-injured my back for the nth time, moving a lot of stuff over many months and months, lower back pain, and, just like residual stress that's kind of left over. So, fell into a bunch of things during this really great period, one of which was brain fog, which is pretty common with COVID and Lyme disease and stress. And then this back pain stuff. I got a brilliant osteopath. I do these exercises every day. The last month I've almost been coming back to life, but it's been a mixed bag, sort of a transition year, moving out to the Bay of Fundy. And one of the things I brag about, it's really boring out there, which is good because we tend to be overstimulated these days because there's a lot of exciting things happening. And I say, I'm not an exciting person. I don't have an exciting life. It's boring by the bay. But really it isn't. Once your senses kind of calm down, there's a lot of good stuff going on.
So tell me about the brain fog. Like, how did that impact you?
Well, one thing is it makes you so stupid that you can't answer that question. And it comes on really, really slowly. And we were just talking, a few minutes ago about some stuff that went on a few years ago. And I'm like, oh yeah, I sort of remember that. And it takes a while, to kind of dial into the memory. But for a bunch of different reasons, the last month, it's been kind of in retreat, as has the back pain. And one interesting thing, by the way, is that physical pain takes a lot out of your brain because your brain is trying to protect your body from moving around too much and having more physical pain. So, you kind of get stupid as your body doesn't want to move. So as the back pain has been reduced and these other things, diagnosed with sleep apnea, by the way, probably had that for an awfully long time, got a machine. So all these things are kind of working in the same direction, some mushrooms and, always had great doctors and everything. But it's like it starts really slow. And in fact, I was just remembering right now when a good friend of mine, an older physicist, was dying of cancer a few years ago. That's the other thing. A lot of people in my life have died in the last few years. And I was kind of an unofficial caregiver with this old friend of mine. And he was doing terribly his last couple of weeks. And that's when I was starting to get fuzzy. And I didn't realize that's when Lyme disease was coming along because I was so stressed from my friend dying that I thought that's why I'm so fuzzy and clumsy. And then later it's like, well, that was part of it, but you were in the early stages of Lyme disease. And so when I, finally the doctor just looked at my rash, which by the way, you don't always get the rash. That's a real, misapprehension. And he just glances at it and he goes, oh yeah, slam dunk, you got Lyme. We're going to give you 2 pills or, 2 weeks of pills and take the first one before you leave here. And so I go to the doctor and I say, how often do you see this? And he goes, oh, you're the second case this shift. So it's all around Nova Scotia and lots of other places. But, these cause and effect stuff is hard to figure out what's what.
Yeah. So when we're in the mode of a caregiver,
Yes.
We're so focused on the other people that we're looking after.
Right.
What's going on with ourselves, and I guess our self-care can slip. So what was the thing that kind of pulled you back in to caring for yourself?
Okay, so one interesting thing is that, there's kind of a caregiver mode of existence. And I didn't realize when I was looking after my good friend that I was slipping back into this really practiced role of looking after other people, because I've been doing it for my whole adult life. So that's a really good question. And when you're in the hardcore caregiver mode, like I was that time, your world actually gets very small. And in order to look after yourself well, and that's one thing, you can tell when you're doing well, you're just kind of looking around more. You notice stuff over here and you notice stuff over there, and you don't obsess about this little detail or that little detail. And when you're in the caregiver mode, you have a lot of responsibilities. And just last while, a couple of people that I've known very well for quite a few years were staying at our place. And they've been in the real caregiver mode, hardcore, for a long time. And just being at our house on the shore for 3 days, you could see them sleeping better, changing, making more bad jokes, just the hanging out stuff. So your world gets small when you're in the caregiver mode. So it sort of backfires. Then you're not a good caregiver anymore, and you're also not looking after yourself. But it's a mode. You fall into the mode and you don't know you're in it because, it's like when you're asleep, you don't know you can be awake. And when you're awake, you don't know you can be asleep. They're just different modes of existence.
So it's a pattern.
It's a deep pattern. And you can see some people, start it really early in life. I mean, some people as children, like people that I know, they, were responsible, had a lot of family responsibilities even as children. So I go back and say, well, my standard life story for me is I had a pretty great childhood, and the South Shore of Nova Scotia, and went to great school in New Hampshire and college in Mass, and we actually lived in Marblehead outside Boston when I was in the 4th grade, and just visited family in Norway a lot. Spent time in France, got close to people. So I say, until I graduated from college, I had a pretty idyllic childhood. Well, nothing's quite that simple, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So, part of it is it can be that childhood pattern. Is it a childhood pattern at play?
Well, see, that's a great question. I don't have an answer to that for me, but I think no. It started after I came back from university, back to Nova Scotia. I didn't want to be in Nova Scotia. I wanted to be down in the States where I had a lot of contacts. I wanted to be a writer. I had no idea how to do that, and I ended up back, after college, and things were okay for a few months. And then I went to Quebec to look for a job, to Montreal to look for a job. And it was strange that in that fall. So I went back down to Western Mass, where I had lived with some other students in this beautiful old house for a while. Then I took a train up to Montreal and I didn't want to be in Montreal. I didn't even want to be in Canada. It got cold. I ran out of money. I got really sick. And then by the time I came back home to my family, my mother had fallen into this massive depression, round about menopause time. And so then everything that had been so highly functioning in my world was going the other way fast, and she wasn't getting the right kind of care enough. She wasn't getting the right meds enough, and nobody knew what to do. So I started my caregiver journey, as I say, trying to help my mother, who was, pretty feisty in a non-positive way.
So do you think there's a cultural pattern in play there? In other words, we're a male and we're expected to be the caregiver provider, and it's a pattern we can fall into?
Sometimes, but I think all this emotional stuff, it's supposed to be women are the ones who are in touch with their emotions. And so the males can be pretty dysfunctional. So they might feel like they have the responsibility, but they don't have the tools. My father, for example, who was a wonderful person and had, so many life skills, and he was a tough guy and successful in business and, very kind and generous and all that stuff. So when my mother started getting feisty, he didn't have an experience in how to deal with that. And we have a lot of pictures of him when he was younger, And he was a big guy, and his mother was very small, and he would generally have his hand on his mother's shoulder, like he was the protector of the small and the weak, which included, in his case, the women. And so when she got to be aggressive with this really bad depression, he just didn't know what to do. So I was there, and I also didn't have any power, because I was just this guy living in the house, and I didn't have any like legal authority or any sort of, in our society, like just, as a guy living in the house who didn't even want to be there. So I just fell into these roles all the time. And I look back now and I can say, well, I'm glad that I did all the stuff that I know. I've helped a lot of people since then. But that pattern of like falling into rescuing people, it's really the rescuer thing that I do. I sit around and like, I don't want to help. Nobody else is doing anything, damn it. Because I don't think I'm a caregiver by nature, but I've just fallen into the rescuer role, watching people not do stuff. And I think that's like endemic in our society now. There's all these very obvious problems that people have, alcoholism and drug problems, or, physical problems. It doesn't matter what. And there's all these resources that are available in our society, but the way in which they're delivered and how you learn about them and how you get them is pretty dysfunctional. And it took me a long time to learn that.
So how did you get through it at that time? I mean, not knowing what you know now. Was it just white knuckle it, or what did you do?
Well, certainly at the beginning, I white knuckled it, and I became, just a big ball of stress. But one kind of amusing thing about this early period I'm talking about, I had two good friends who lived out in the country in a beautiful little house, and a few of us used to hang out there a lot. And it's kind of like where we live now. It was a beautiful old house right on the shore, and there was nothing to do there except for like make jokes and hang out. So I lived in these two worlds. I'd be out there with my friends having a great time, and then I'd go home, and my mother would be sitting in a chair and saying the same things over and over. So that's kind of what got me through that initial period.
So was there a moment when you realized that, hey, you weren't just juggling all the care and all the things that you had to do for all these people, but that you were actually burning out?
I would say no, or it was so gradual. It was just like, oh yeah, here's this pattern again and again. And an interesting thing was when you start to distrust the authorities, not because they're bad or wrong or not at all, but it's just like, their worlds are very complicated as well. So when my mother first got sick, like in the early 70s, like her psychiatrist in Halifax was the head of the department, and he was this older guy, and he was great. And he and my mother would like crack jokes when she was starting to get better, but he wasn't keeping her on the meds that were working, and eventually she would fall apart, and so I would come back. And so one day I said, well, is there anything you can do just to prolong this, this good period? And I just remember being in the waiting room that day, and there were like 6 women sitting around, and they all had this like look in their eye like my mother. It's basically psychosis, they're so depressed, they're psychotic, and they're just like staring into space. And I looked at all these women, and then I was reading this like psychiatry like journal, and with diagrams, and and I've actually studied some neuroscience and things, and but I remember looking around and then talking to the psychiatrist later and saying, can you give her something that will keep her more on an even keel, because it was a pretty complex case that she had actually. And his answer to me was yes, but if I hadn't initiated this. And so for the rest of her life, she, would go on and off her meds, maybe, but she was on a little balance of drugs that when she was on them, she was doing pretty well. And I remember thinking, well, why did I have to say it to this doctor? And I'm not criticizing him in the slightest. He had God knows how many patients, and there's a lot was known later about these medications and how they interact and all that sort of stuff. But I had quite a few episodes like that where I realized that the caregiver world, like social workers and all that, like they had so many limitations themselves, but you tend to like just go along with the crowd, because they're the experts. So it's not like it's anybody's fault, but the system itself is pretty not functional.
Yeah, and as a caregiver, I mean, you're responsible for the well-being of the people that are under your care. So, how did the stress of actually learning to navigate the system on top of all that impact you?
So the biggest thing, and I can't remember exactly after how many years of this, but My youngest sister in her teens she was living in the house when all this was going on. And she went from being a carefree, happy person. She was like small and very good looking and very quiet. She didn't steal the show, but she had a lot of talents. Like she was really good at math, anything to do with numbers and logic. She was good at languages. She was very good at music and art and athletics. So that's quite a suite. But she wasn't like in your face. She just learned stuff easily and blended it together. And one interesting thing was that I think she took piano lessons for maybe 3 years. And her piano teacher said, Janet's got the best innate grasp of music theory of any student that I've ever had. She was this older lady. So Janet just, had all this talent, or she wouldn't play the piano for a year, and then she'd sit down and look at some music and go, la, 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 la. She taught herself to paint. And
just intuitive.
Well, yeah, just all these things have blended together. And but then, later in her teenage years, she started to act a little bit different. And she would kind of go in and out of being okay and to not okay. And in her early 20s, she was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. And so then that was joined into the mix. And then she became highly dysfunctional. And so I would be kind of unofficial caregiver for her and taking her to see a doctor every now and then. And sometimes she would be compliant, as they say, and sometimes she wouldn't. And that was more than I could take. And I actually got her in a 30-day program twice in the local hospital, and where, she was on medication and it worked. You could see her, she was getting better. And then after the 30 days, she'd go off it and she'd go gonk like that. So, there's more to life than just medication, but in some cases it really does work. So I was way over my head then. And one of my tough learning experiences was I was told by a social worker that if somebody in that state is like out on the street, they're more likely to get help in the sense that they're going to be so pathetic, they're going to end up in the system for a while. And if they have a good doctor and good medication and good whatever the heck it is, that can turn their lives around. And when she said that, I went, oh my gosh, David, whatever's going to happen, you have to file that away for the future. So there was a terrible episode years later where she went missing in Dartmouth, and I thought that one winter night, I thought that she had committed suicide, because that was one of her threats over the years, and she had actually jumped in the water a couple of times. And I thought, oh my goodness, she went missing overnight. This is probably the end of her. And it turns out it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because she couldn't sleep. She'd been walking up and down the train tracks, and she just didn't sleep, part of her illness. And so we found out that she was still around late the next day. And anyway, I got her to the local clinic sometime after supper, and I got her in the bath because she was frozen, and then she went to the local clinic, and the doctor said, well, we can, I agree with you, she should go to the mental hospital, in the mental, and he said, but we can never tell who they will take. And the fact that her physical condition is so terrible increases the chance that they will accept her. So her fingernails were like this long and curly. Her toenails were long and curly. She had frostbite on her hands and her feet. Her hair was a mess. Her hygiene was terrible, because schizophrenics, that's one of the symptoms of schizophrenics. So he said, acting strange isn't always enough. If your physical condition is terrible, that increases the chance. So we did get her into the hospital later in the evening, and a psychiatrist came down. It wasn't that late, but he lived nearby, and he wasn't too happy to be called in, for this emergency call. He was pretty rude to me. But he said, okay, we'll keep her overnight. I can't make any promises. And then he was gone. And I got a call later the next day from another doctor at the hospital who said, David, you did the right thing. We're going to look after her. Don't worry. She'll start to get better. And then he goes, how are you doing? How is your wife doing? So I'd never heard this in all my years of care.
That was the first time you'd been asked?
Right. In decades. So that was like a great big check mark for me. And what he said actually came true, because she was on medication, and you could see, I would see her basically every Wednesday for months and months. And every time I saw her, she was a little bit better. And one thing with her illness was that she didn't sleep. So her eyes were always cloudy. And the first time I saw her after she'd been in the hospital for a couple of days, couple nights, and I looked at her eyes, and her eyes were clear because she'd had 2 good sleeps. So, I mean, there's more to life than medication, but it really can work. And it took many, many months for her to get quite a bit better. And then she was in the rehab center on the grounds, which was a very nice place, and getting more therapy and, very well looked after. And then she went into a halfway house in the south end of Halifax, where she was quite well looked after. But the problem was, as I was told by several doctors several times, if this would have happened 20 years ago, maybe she would have been married and had kids and had a career. But because she got her treatment so late, it helped her a lot, but only up to a point. And one common symptom of schizophrenia, they call it a negative symptom, is basically just apathy. She still had all this talent. Her intellect came back more than I could ever have imagined, and she was very empathic with people. But she didn't really care too much about, before she'd be reading books and teaching herself to paint, and, she had all these interests. And now it was all very superficial. She hung out with her friends at the coffee shop, and she was a great person again, but she'd lost that life trajectory, which she was never going to get back.
So it's an important thing to catch it as early as possible. Is it a function of the disease progresses so much, or is it just a function of time lost? Or both?
Well, yeah, both for sure. It's I'm just kind of like, re-experiencing some of this stuff right now.
Well, as you know, when we think about trauma, the brain experiences it as real.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So I can go back into that zone. And so for myself, I've had a lot of different stresses of different types, and I've had, gone to different psychologists, and everybody's been helpful. And one guy in particular was a former family doctor in Nova Scotia who'd learned hypnotherapy for looking after, pregnant women and women who were giving birth and had given birth, just how to, calm down the patient. And he was doing this part-time as an old guy, and he was fantastic. Well-known guy actually in the world of hypnotherapy, and he went to some big conferences and was very well respected. And I would show up at his office, and he'd be wearing a yellow shirt, like a positive color. And then he would, in his little office, the top of the wall was painted yellow, and we'd have our hypnotherapy, and we got to be friends. And then as I was leaving, he would always say, better days ahead. And what he was doing was just programming you to be more positive and, sort of focus on that way. And, he helped a lot. So I was diagnosed with PTSD with him, and he didn't want to hear too many of the stories, because once the pattern was obvious, he goes, yes, of course you have PTSD. Then more recently, I had some more, this brain fog stuff was happening. I actually got really lucky in the system, and there's like a seniors clinic that just opened up. So I went there, and I was examined by 2 doctors and assorted people and my wife and all that stuff. And the answer was, your symptoms are consistent with PTSD, not with dementia, etc., but with PTSD. So that was good news. And then I had a follow-up with the psychiatrist, and he said, well, actually, it's general anxiety disorder. It's like PTSD is kind of like one of the many little subsets of this. But the main point is that, it'll just come and go, and you'll be triggered by something. So the better your physical health, the better your social health, the better your overall environment, all that kind of stuff. But then every now and then you'll get a little ping, which it comes from the past. It'll trigger you from something that happened in the past, and you're like, you go right back there. So, I think I've come a long way in the last couple of months, but I can still go back into that little zone,
Yeah, I mean, when we think about trauma and the brain, and I've been there myself through my struggles with depression, I can, spin off and ruminate into the worst possible scenarios, and my brain doesn't know the difference if it thinks it's real.
Right. Yeah. So a wonderful analogy that I like, there's a famous executive coach guy, but his opening line is that, would you trust somebody for a third of their life they were either unconscious or hallucinating? And the answer is, well, of course you wouldn't trust that person. But what he means is, when you're asleep for a third of your life. So you're either like blacked out or you're having a dream, say. So, you're unconscious or you're hallucinating, and then you wake up. It's like, oh, where am I now? And then you have to sort of reset. So, we come and go through different stages of consciousness.
And I mean, I've heard a couple of different takes on labeling, right? So like labeling depression, anxiety, PTSD. And I've heard one school of thought that it's not helpful to label things. Mm-hmm. And I've heard another school of thought that says, yes, it is helpful because now you know what you're dealing with and you know the steps you can take. And what's your opinion on that statement?
Yeah, well, DSM-5, and I remember back in this great college I went to, many years ago, and a friend of mine next door, this long-haired guitarist dude, and he wanted to go to medical school, and they said, well, and he wanted to take so he wanted to take biochemistry, and they said, well, you have to take chemistry first. So somehow he was able to like finesse the system so that he was able to just take biochemistry and get perfect marks and all that sort of stuff. But the point of the experience is, like you can guide your own life. You can just take that and you have to make your own roadmap. And I think one of the problems that we have nowadays is like the world is full of great advice, some of which may be like exactly the wrong thing for you to hear. So you've kind of got to make your own roadmap.
So, talking about going back to the experience with your sister, how did your role as a caregiver evolve from that? And what did you learn about your own resilience?
Yeah, well, evolution was the word. And here's just an interesting thing. Like I come back to the office after being over, all four of our parents ended up in like a retirement home. And then there was my sister down the road in the group home. So I would, sometimes at lunch, I would go to both places. And by the time I came back, I was kind of like quivering. It was just too much sensory overload. The old people in their wheelchairs in the hall and in the elevator, and then my sister in the group home. And I'd come back and I, maybe tell a little story of a few sentences to these younger people. And like they literally didn't even hear what I said. And it wasn't because they weren't listening. They were busy. It was the office. They were staring at their computer or something. But they didn't have that experience yet. So that was another thing that made it difficult. And that's why sometimes you start hanging around with other people that are, in the same zone. And the social thing too, this is very interesting. So my sister, the schizophrenic, would hang around with other schizophrenics out in the world. They kind of find each other. So, high functioning people sort of hang out with high functioning people, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a well-known psychiatrist from Nova Scotia, Dr. Stan Kuchar, who's been a global expert on adolescent health and the health of young people for decades. And I remember interviewing him a long time ago, and he made a general statement, and he said, we're always spiraling up or we're spiraling down. So just say you're having a bad day, doesn't matter why. Started out okay, a bunch of bad stuff happened, or when things are really going your way, you're sort of spiraling up. So when people get stuck in these mental health problems, their friends become people who really, can give them some drugs and some cigarettes, but not really help them. And they spiral down, and they can't look after their physical appearance and their hygiene and where they're going to live. So, we're all like that, and we all go up and down. But in our society, too many people get left by the side of the road while we talk the right talk, but they've been maybe spiraling down for years and years. And, here's some horrible example, but, you hear about some shooting that goes on, and people say, I don't know what happened. A year ago he was doing great, and 2 years ago he was doing great, but 6 months ago he started talking funny, and then, then he went out and started shooting. Well, this psychotic episode or something happened. He just didn't just start today. And there's a lot of that stuff going on, and the media just reports on it like, it's like on a random car accident. But no, some of the stuff is not random. It's very long term, and it could have been flagged a lot earlier, and some sort of interventions, can be done.
Yeah, we don't always recognize the signs. I recently had a conversation with a friend about suicide, and how I'd learned that when somebody is actually sad and depressed and at their darkest is not when you really need to be watchful. It's when that person all of a sudden becomes happy and content and peaceful because they've made a plan. Right. And it's not that obvious.
So my sister, after, doing very well in this group home, or, quite well for a long time, I used to see her for like coffee or lunch about once a month or twice a month, but, at least once a month. We're talking for years. And then there was this 1 month where I called her up and I said, I'm downtown, you want to go have lunch? And she said, no, I'm not feeling very well. So I said, okay. And then a couple of weeks later, the same thing happened. And she said, no, I'm still not feeling very well. I was downtown at the time. And it turned out that I didn't realize, but she'd been planning her own suicide of jumping in the water for months and months. And it's just exactly what you say. So they would let her go and stay at a friend's place for, first it would be like 1 night and then maybe 2 nights, and years have been gone by, and then it would be maybe like 4 or 5 nights, and then she'd go back. And when she was at the friend's place, she would stop taking her meds. So she would slip. And then when she went back, she'd be on the full dose, but that wouldn't be enough to get her back up. So this has been going on for quite a while. So she got into that place that you just described, where she was, and in fact, I was just reading about this the other day. When you're really terribly depressed or whatever, you just don't function, you don't do anything. But when you start to get better and your mind becomes clear, you go, oh, gee, my life is a mess. Well, actually, it is a mess. And now you've got some energy. So maybe you use that energy into making a plan to commit suicide. And so it's exactly what you just said is what happened to her. And she ended up, jumping into the harbor and was found a couple hours later, like floating in the harbor. So that was, that was like boom, boom, boom. David, come on down to the police station. And I had no idea that, they'd already found the body. And, so that was, that's not an unusual story, I guess. And even in where she was getting good care and being well watched and having healthy food and in a great part of town, and she did have friends, lots of good stuff going on. But that's exactly what you just said. She was in that dangerous zone. And I've been learning about that. And sometimes that danger zone lasts for months and months and months. So that increases the chance that they'll actually do it. Sometimes it's for a few weeks, sometimes it's for a few days. But for Janet, it was for a few months. And she sort of was taking the meds back in the group home, and she seemed to be doing okay. But really, it's exactly what you described. And she was smart enough that she threw people off the scent. She told a few people over the previous couple of weeks about she had a plan to do something, but it was like in a local lake. And she didn't tell anybody that she knew would be able to, get back to her, or could get back to the group home or get back to me. So she was, extremely clever, and she carried out what she wanted. And the sort of terrible thing to say was it maybe wasn't so bad, because she had, she was a great person in a lot of ways, her intellect and her empathy and all that, but she'd kind of lost her passions. And she'd been in this like holding place for quite a long time. So I came to grips with, she actually had quite a few good years. And if we could have gotten her into the treatment way before and had it stick, but I came to terms with it myself. But now for me, it's like I look around, you see somebody on the corner and you go, well, there's somebody that probably has mental health or addiction services. How long are they going to be on that corner? And the answer is, maybe a long freaking time, and they're not going to get help. Or if they do, it'll be quick and superficial,
Yeah, because I liken it to, for me personally, it was a feeling of being pulled back in. So you start to get in front of things finally after trying so many things. And then, like you said, you have that clarity of where things have landed in your life. And you've lost a lot of time. And you've lost a lot of productive years. And you've lost little pieces of yourself. And it can pull you back in harder than it ever was in the beginning.
Right. And one of my little aphorisms is, if you hear a story that's very strange, it's probably true, because it's too weird to be made up. And you just reminded me of going to the dollar store a few years ago, and there was a guy like with a sleeping bag, and it was like the fall, and he was doing terribly, and he was some kind of an immigrant guy, and he was, people would like avoid him as they went into the dollar store. But because of my experience with this stuff, I sometimes just, you just end up talking to people. So we're talking back and forth, and you can see like his eyes lit up just because I was asking him real questions. So we were talking, and he said one thing which made me think this was not bullshit, the story that he had, because he said he was an immigrant and he had a job in a construction company, and then this happened and that happened. It all fell apart. He was, trying to get his, visa updated and all that stuff. So I said, well, where do you actually stay? And he goes, well, behind that grocery store over there, I have a little tent. And I was doing okay, but now that it's getting cold, I'm not doing okay. And I'll be in my little tent. And he said, there's raccoons around there, because it was wooded. And he said, I'd be lying in my sleeping bag in my little tiny pseudo tent, and I could feel something nibbling on my wrists, and it was a raccoon. And I thought, you don't make that story up, you know?
Yeah.
And then, like, you know, he just appreciated the fact that I was talking to him like human to human. So I mentioned something to my wife, who was shopping around the corner, and she came back. When she came back a while later, she had like a shopping bag full of like food for this guy, including, you know, chocolate bars, quick energy, but whatever. And he was like so appreciative that we'd helped him, and so appreciative that, you know, I was listening to him and taking him seriously. And that little story about like I could feel a raccoon nibbling on my wrist, like, you don't make that story up. And these people are all over the place on planet Earth, and, you know, in encampments or whatever. And, you know, we walk by, or we say, oh, you know, they got drug problems and booze problems, which they may very well do. And sometimes, you know, that's just a way of dealing with mental illness, or you're just addicted to your substance. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I find one of the dangers, and it's not an indictment of anyone or anything in particular. It's just the way things evolve. We're in a place of superficiality with it to some degree, is my opinion, because we're encouraged to talk about it and talk about our experiences, but then at the same time, there's still that stigma floating around. So to some degree, it can feel like a setup.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of, like, in fact, I don't like the word resilience. It's like a buzzword. Because,
What's a better word?
Well, just let me go down my little route here. So if you know people that are really resilient, they've come out of something really tough. And so some of this is just freaking luck, right? Like, some people just naturally are, doesn't matter what the hell happens to them, they're going to be okay. But some people are okay because they survived over and over and over, and they know how lucky they are. So I know quite a few people who are survivors, and they're just lucky that they survived. So that's why I'm skeptical of this word resilience. For example, my Uncle Teddy from Norway, who they got occupied in their little house on the fjord in August. They were living in London, England in the 30s, doing well. And anyway, they went back to Norway for their 2-week vacation and got occupied by the Nazis for 4 years. So I've been hearing these stories, you know, since I was a little kid. Same thing happened with the Russian Revolution in Russia. They barely survived the family. So there's my Uncle Teddy, who was this, like, you know, bulked up guy. He never lifted any weights, but he did all these sports. He was like this super athlete, and he was like a chess champion, boxing champion. He didn't like to box, but he didn't like to lose either. Like All England in rugby, and, you know, spoke a bunch of languages and all that sort of stuff. So he goes into this concentration camp for 2 years, where every single day he didn't know if he was going to be alive the next day, for many, many reasons. And so I've been hearing these stories, you know, since I was a kid. And he, later in life, he talked about it a lot. My grandfather talked about it, and, you know, these stories would float around. But you realize, like, you know, Teddy was this resilient guy, but he was also just lucky, and he friggin' knew it, to be alive. And, you know, you couldn't bullshit the guy about anything. And he was very, very objective. But he just knew that he was lucky to be alive. And then when he was in midlife, he was in a bicycle accident where a little bit of snow in Norway, and his bicycle went sliding into the headlight of a little delivery vehicle, and his face and head went right into this, and they didn't know if he was going to live. And he was in a coma for months, and he came out of it, and he slowly recovered. So he's like the most resilient person you can ever imagine. But is he a good example of how to live your life? No. You know, he got lucky a whole bunch of times. And here's an interesting thing too. Like, if you know he lived to be 102. Wow. Played golf till he was 99, even though his, you know, health never really recovered. His digestive system was ruined from, like, you know, starvation. And but he, you know, very competitive. Played golf, sailed, did all kinds of stuff. He could solve the Rubik's Cube when he was 100, you know, pretty fast. And he was lucky to be alive. And so, you know, there's that luck factor that's there. And so when I see the word resilience, I go, well, what about all the resilient people that didn't quite make it? So it's like superficial terminology. And then when you really get into the nitty gritty of the stories of some of these people, what they've been through, you know, like, for example, I know some people have been in the special forces, and they go off for 6 weeks somewhere in the world, whatever they do. And when they come back, they basically recuse themselves, you know, go into solitary confinement at home for 2 weeks, just to let their nervous system climb down. And then they kind of come back out again. And, you know, they don't talk about what they did. The people that do that are like the most naturally athletic and psychologically resilient people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. But they kind of got to go into self-protection mode when they come back from their assignment.
That makes sense. You're actually, it's funny because you're putting a new spin on an experience of mine personally, which was because I would always talk about resilience a lot, but I was resilient, or I guess strong enough to hang on to the point where I found the right therapist who made a difference, who managed to get me on the right path of doing the right things. But now you've just raised the question in the back of my mind that if I hadn't met that person, how much longer could I have hung on the path I was on?
So that's the luck thing. We really don't focus enough, business people, they forgot how hard their early years were. And they also forgot all the breaks that they got along the way, to doing well. And so luck is just such a hugely important part of life. And I remember talking to a guy who came to, he's a chartered accountant from Pakistan. And he said he knew a guy back in Pakistan who lived in a dump, because people would live in these gigantic, landfills, live and die in these landfills. And he said, one of my goals is to fund a little college back home in this rural area so these talented people can get out of where they live. And here was his example. He said, there's this one guy, and he found an old glove, and he hooked up a whole bunch of electronics to this old glove. And he said, so with this glove, he could manipulate his computer. And he didn't do this at a college or a university or a lab experiment. He did it in a landfill. And you think of all the millions of people around the world are just in abject poverty or whatever the problem might be. They don't have a freaking chance. So even just to grow up in this society in this time in history, you're lucky, and even if you're really poor, you can have your little cell phone and be tapped into things. So another thing that happens is if things are too good, you get lazy and, you complain about stuff. So there's a sort of a sweet spot in life where this is this resilience thing where, it's something that you can manage. If it's too difficult, you're eventually going to fold. And if it's too easy, you complain. And it's like finding that sweet spot. So knowing my uncle, the stuff that he went through, and he'd tell you these detailed stories, which would all be surprising, because when you get down to the details, it's not the generalities. It's these weird little things that happened or didn't happen. Somebody will recount, it's like the raccoon nibbling on my wrist. Well, he didn't make that up.
So it sets up the risk of us becoming complacent. And there's a saying I like. It's related to democracy, and I you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's by Jefferson or somebody, one of the Constitution framers, that says the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And I've always applied that one to my mental health. In other words, don't become complacent. Always do the work. And when I'm feeling good is the time when I really need to do the work.
Yes, and also so here's the other thing. It's about what is the environment in which you live. So to me, that's the most important thing, actually. And I took a seminar decades ago with this guy, Robert Fritz, who's a musician. He teaches creativity, and it was a fantastic thing. It was a 1-week thing. And his thing is he calls it structural thinking. And the essence of it is very simple. But what he says is that the structure is more powerful than the person. And his little simple metaphor is a rocking chair. You have a bunch of chairs there. Well, whoever sits in the rocking chair is going to rock. It's got nothing to do with whether he wants to rock or not, or if he's a good rocker, or if he's having a great day. It's just if you're in a rocking chair, you're going to rock. That's his metaphor. And like Stan Kutcher says, you're either spiraling up or you're spiraling down. So if you're in a supportive environment, whatever that happens to be for you, you're going to do well. And if the rug is pulled out from underneath you, everything's going to fall apart. So, you met just the right doctor at the right time. You might not have done it, but at least you're in a country that has doctors and, there are supports that are out there. So, I think what is the structure that our society needs overall to be going forward into the future? And I've been reading a bunch of books lately about, we all know the pace of change, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the part of the pace of change part is that our brains can't process the world that we live in. And one really simple reason for that is that we don't think we're part of nature. We don't think we're like a deer or a bird or something. It's like we watch nature on TV and on a screen. And if you get in your car, you're looking at a screen. Maybe you got a little screen down there. You're listening to something. Google's telling you where to go, and you're driving way too fast, and you're burning up the planet and heating up the planet, but you think it's not about us because like we're not animals. So if you go back to your grandparents and your great-grandparents, to people that were, maybe cutting down a tree or catching a fish and making a fire and all that stuff, well, they were in nature and they were more tuned into it. And they would look up at the sky and go, oh, yeah, it's going to rain tomorrow afternoon, I think, and the wind is doing this and they could feel it. So we become these sort of like detached beings with our wonderful digital technology, and it is wonderful. But we've forgotten that we're part of nature. And as we lose nature, more and more we lose that connection, and we become sort of like spoiled 10-year-olds, give me more of what I want. And who cares about that guy over there?
And the instant dopamine hits.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Burning through your dopamine pretty fast, but not really getting much done. So there's really a lot to be said for, if things are too easy, it doesn't work. And if they're too hard, it doesn't work. So what is the part for you? So with my uncle who'd survived, the concentration camp, it's like every day was pretty amazing. And I remember like late in his life, and once I was talking to him on the phone and I said something about, do you have any stress now, Teddy? And he literally laughed. Like he didn't, he just laughed. And he goes, no, I don't have any stress. I have a nap every afternoon. Because what he'd been through gave him so much perspective that he had health problems and he had this problem and he had that problem. But his just view of life was, I go outside for a little walk every morning. There's my relatives in the next building over and I don't have any stress.
So we can do some little things to change our environment and set us up for quote unquote success, which is a very, personal measure. But, even if it's just turning off the phone and going for a walk on a trail.
Oh yeah, so much, right? You and I are both kind of nature nuts. I mean, 10 minutes on walking on the trail and whatever was really bothering you before, you sort of can't even remember now.
Yeah.
Because you're breathing and, you're picking up those little molecules from the trees and the breeze and all that stuff. That's just so basic. And but also the awareness. And I think when you're caught in like the caregiver mode, you lose that bigger awareness. It's like, I got to do this, and I got to do the other thing. So I like the word burnout, which I think technically is mostly used for like the world of work.
We associate it with the office environment, right? Yeah.
Right. And I just like it as a general term. It's like when you're burned out, you're not going to make good decisions. And so whatever you can do to sort of go back the other way. And when you get into this, so I've had these periods for years where I was doing really, really well, way beyond, average. And I've also had these other periods which were not like that. And the trigger would often be, you hear about some family crisis and you jump into that mode. But then you got to remember, oh yeah, I was in these really good. So one way to tell for me, when I'm doing well, my senses are much more tuned in. Like your eyesight's a little bit better, and you can feel the wind a little bit here and you're aware of somebody talking over there, just calmly, your senses are tuned in. And if you get, too negative, but even too positive, like this toxic positivity stuff, then you're not really in touch with the world around you. Like this great studio that we're in here, for example.
Yeah, because I like that idea because you can get too positive and then we end up glossing over things that maybe we need to recognize or deal with. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely it is. And there's a lot of that going on in the world now. And, people try to sell you stuff. So the internet has a bad case of trying to sell you stuff, which we haven't come to terms with. And the internet has trained us to expect us to be mostly free or at least cheap. And we have the world's resources at our disposal, but we don't want to pay for stuff. Meanwhile, these massive data centers are gobbling through energy and spewing, pollutants out into the environment at an incredible rate. And we don't really care about that because, and people are so impatient now. I find it really amusing. If you're on the phone with someone, they're looking something up on their phone and they, just a minute, excuse me. And they apologize. I go, I'm not in a rush. If you have to take 3 minutes to find something for my benefit, I'm okay with it. But it's this sort of reflexive impatience that's floating around now. And that's very superficial and actually kind of boring.
And it's this also this idea that things should be easy. Solutions should be easy and quick at hand when sometimes, what do you think of the idea that some things should be hard?
Absolutely. And in fact, as a writer, I kind of rant about all the many words I don't like resilience. So I don't like the word solution.
Okay.
Because I actually did take some math and physics, and solution has a very specific word. So then in the computer world, it was borrowed for, basically writing a good program. And then it went into the marketing world, solution, blah, 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 blah. But all the great things, important things in the world didn't just sort of fall in your lap. So, to me, I like the old fashioned word like programmer. I didn't like, systems analyst and everything. Like, no, it's not a solution, buddy. It's a program. Sorry, I hate to tell you. So that's just more of this like sort of soft sell bullshit. And if I know some creative people in a lot of fields, and they spend a lot of time and they make a lot of mistakes, and then they go somewhere. And so part of creativity, which is kind of one of my real interests, is it's a very unpredictable path. So when you start saying, here's the solution, blah, 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 here's this other solution, we're going to disrupt stuff with all of our clever solutions. Well, that's not really creativity. Because if you know the story of the people and the teams that actually made stuff, it was a real wiggly road with a lot of frustrations and a lot of luck also. And I mean, even like some of the stuff I've been reading lately, I mean, what's happened on planet Earth in the last 150 years, in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years is absolutely incredible. Like I was reading something about the iPhone, and they said it's like 4,000 people contributed to the development of the iPhone over quite a many year period, for which like 6 got credit in the end. But that's the way it is with everything. And again, it goes back to luck, because some people do a lot of tremendous work, but they don't really reap the benefits. And here's a kind of an ironic little thing too. So the word innovation, what it really means now is something you can sell. That's what it means. So one of my big insights is that in the business world, a lot of the innovation is actually in the business model, not just in the actual device, if you're talking about a device or something like that. But it's rather somebody's figured out how to sell it to you in a form that's going to work, often by trial and error. And some other guy in the other lab over might be doing more revolutionary stuff, but it'll be 15 years before a business model pops up that allows that to come into the world.
So there's an interesting juxtaposition there with mental health. Because what occurs to me as you're saying that is think less about finding a solution and more about finding a model.
Right. And also like the Stan Kuchar thing, if you can just do a few little things so you're slowly spiraling up, and then get rid of a couple things that are keeping you spiraling down, just these like slight subtle adjustments and sort of sticking with them, and you're going to have setbacks, absolutely. But, going for like the solution, the perfect medication, the perfect plan, well, there ain't no perfect. But as long as you're sort of going, and so that comes back to the environment. If you're in an environment that's overall supportive, and if you're walking down the street and you see some guy with his hand out and you just like wish he wasn't there, well, that's not part of a sophisticated society to me.
How important do you think creativity is to us when we're like finding our model and seeking better mental health?
Well, one weird thing that I have read is that creative people tend to have more people with mental illness in their family and their extended family. So this person over here may, and in fact, a lot of brilliant people are bipolar, like Winston Churchill, a lot of the big high-powered people in history, in business and in government and all that, they have this extra energy. They're perhaps manic or hypomanic or something like that. They just have that energy and that drive, which could collapse. But it's it's just, in an environment where you're going to get recognized if you have an issue, or if you reach out, are you going to get any help? Are you in that environment or not? And that's where sometimes like one person can make a huge difference. Like I know me, I call myself the reluctant rescuer. I'm not a caregiver type. That's one reason why. But but just, the reluctant rescuer, but with the experience that I had over the years, I've actually helped quite a few people when I realized that they weren't going to get the help because of A, B, C, or D. And I just like pushed and they got help. So, I've helped a lot of people, and if you have one friend or one relative or one teacher or one colleague, it's like, I don't care what the corporate culture is overall. If you have one person in your outfit that's going to help you, that's fantastic. Whereas we all talk the right talk now, but you got to have individuals putting their credibility on the line and trying to help you.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been friends for a while, and so I can attest to that because you've done that for me at points. When I've been at a low point, I haven't been able to see things clearly. You've been that stalwart voice.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I remember one time in particular, this one time, and you told me years later, you said, David, I went into that office and you were still there. Nobody else was there. And you said, you just talked to me for 5 minutes and you just said what I needed to hear, that little bit of positivity that, I could find the help I needed. You told me that years later. And I just remember that so clearly.
Yeah, it was a very pivotal moment for me because it pulled me out of myself and it just got me into another perspective. And I had a lot of different people around me, and it's not to knock anyone because I'm fond of the statement, and it's true, that we can only operate at the level of what we know.
Right.
We can only help and add what we know. But what's your opinion on this statement? It's a fine line between a caregiver and an enabler.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. And and that when you know caregivers well, like these, two women I was hanging out with lately who I know very well, and it's like they use all their talent. They're way overstretched in what they have to do day by day, week by week. So their talent goes into helping other people, and then they forget how to help themselves. So at the same time as they are being caregivers, but they're also enablers, and then they kind of shut down. And it's amazing how if somebody's dependent on you and you disappear forever, they might find help from somebody else. So it's like share the responsibility. And that fine line, that's when you lose perspective, and you're an enabler at that time.
Yeah, because sometimes we need to know when to pull back and I guess let somebody get a little air under their wings themselves.
Right. And part of that is judging how well they're doing, because sometimes somebody's literally going to probably commit suicide in the next few days or the next few hours. But on the other hand, sometimes someone's on a wiggly journey, but they're going up and they just need a little bit more help, and it doesn't have to be all from you.
Yeah, and that can have a big impact on us when we're a caregiver and we've done all the things and it's still at the end was a tragic result, let's say.
Right. So the fact that we don't talk about this stuff, or we just talk in platitudes, but our society has gone a long way since I went through some of this early stuff, like in the early 70s, when people didn't talk about this at all. And now we talk about it, but the trick is to do stuff. Don't just talk about it, but do stuff. And there's no guarantees. So I sort of use my sister Janet's life as a metaphor. She actually had a lot of good years that I didn't expect. But as I was told several times by doctors, if she would have gotten help when she was like 22, not 42, or whatever the years were, it could have been a very different outcome. Not guaranteed, but if you're afraid to talk about stuff, then nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, and most of us in that position, we're not professionals, so it's a lot of trial and error.
Right. And even for the professionals, by the way, it's like, because, the human brain, the human mind is a great big friggin' mystery. And every DSM is quite different from the previous one.
Yeah. And our brain plays tricks on us. It fools us. And so by necessity there, it's going to fool somebody who's in a position to help us.
And here's one interesting thing, too. Like, you have to be wary of too much certitude. Because one characteristic of mental illness is that, I know I'm right. And I might have this crazy story because I've been, strange beings were talking to me in the middle of the night, but I know that I'm right. And it seems like in our society now, there's so much polarization where, this group over here, they know that they're right about pretty much everything. And by the way, this other group over there are kind of wrong about everything. Well, that sort of like fake certitude is not the way to build up a good society.
No, because there's a lot of pop psychology out there. And there's a lot of people talking about psychology and mental health. And you can listen to two different people and they'll have extremely different answers.
Right. But sometimes, like blending Eastern methods and Western methods and, meditation and, walking in the woods and all kinds of, interesting things, many of which I've done myself, can be very, very helpful for a whole lot of reasons. And so I think, blending, Western science with, kind of Eastern approaches instead of it's all one or all the other. And like, I think this vaccine skepticism, for example, is a really great example of how, like false certitude. And so by the way, like my Uncle Teddy, he had typhus in the concentration camp at the end of his term there, and the German doctor cured him with the vaccine. He was really lucky. He got seen early, and he got whatever vaccine they had then. And the German doctor wouldn't send him back to the camp because he said Teddy still has typhus. And he said, so my life was saved by a kind German doctor. And another weird thing.
In an unkind system.
In an unkind system. But one individual did what he did. And some of this stuff's a little bit spooky. So actually, his parents were in Moscow. I forget what year it was exactly. But his mother, my grandmother, had typhus as well at that time. And she was pretty advanced. And my grandfather, they were staying at this hotel, and he was in the restaurant or the bar, and he was just talking to this Russian scientist. And the guy had just come back from Chicago, and he said, well, we're working on this new vaccine now, and it looks like it's pretty good. And I actually have some samples in my bag. And he went and he got the samples and gave it to my grandfather, who gave it to my grandmother, and just in the nick of time, because she was probably on her way out, and they just caught it in time, and after a few weeks went by. So that's like 2 incidents in my own family of, boring old Western medicine doing a really good job. And yet now there's, massive so-called evidence, which is all like phony baloney statistics about, why vaccines are bad and why these standard treatments. So, well, of course you want to be skeptical and up to a point. But I mean, some of this stuff, the evidence that it works and it's safe is just absolutely massive.
Yeah, and I mean, it always seems to me, the more and more I read and the more I hear and the more people I listen to, it seems to like going back to fundamentals. It's getting in nature, watching our diet, managing our stress, breathing.
So that's true. But at the same time, like we don't realize that just a few years ago, a few generations ago, people just died from everything. Women in childbirth, or the baby died in the first 6 months, or they had 12 kids and, 4 of them lived. You don't have to go back very many generations. And I know, like looking at some old cemeteries in Nova Scotia, which are not that old compared to Europe and all that stuff. And you'll see, I went to a couple places recently, you see like 3 children died in one summer, 3 children from one family from diphtheria. So people, and especially in warm climates where there's so many more bugs and all that stuff. But now we kind of take pretty good health, for granted. But in the old days, they didn't, because they didn't have much control over that stuff. And, you'd wash your hands and you'd, go milk the cow, and then you'd wash your hands again. But if your kids got sick, there weren't many resources that could help you.
So we're lucky, going back to luck, we're lucky to be in the time we're in.
Yes, exactly. We are, and we have a lot of responsibility because, really climate change and global warming and all the related stuff, we have the tools to kind of dial it back. And in fact, I was just reading about James Lovelock of the Gaia hypothesis, the guy who said that, the planet itself is a great big, sort of living system, which is recalibrating all the time, all the different species. And actually that hypothesis had been proven quite a long time ago, and he had many scientific breakthroughs and developed instruments, and he wasn't some flaky woo-woo dude. But we're in this like little planet floating out there in space with a very narrow troposphere at the top, and we have the knowledge of what we're doing to it, and we also have the tools to start dialing it back. And so like that's our challenge of today.
So speaking of living systems,
yeah.
With the stress of being a caregiver and the trauma and everything that came with it, did that have an effect, do you think, on the physical health issues?
Oh, absolutely.
That you experienced?
Oh, yeah.
So?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, my blood pressure would go up. And it's weird, this back pain stuff, because I've hurt my back, many times over the years. And that in itself, like sort of shuts down your brain. But yeah, I had all kinds of health problems. If you're living in that state of stress, you sort of start to take that stuff for granted. And then when you start to chill out, then you can see, what's working and what's not working. But, just stress alone, it's kind of an overused term, but it puts you in yeah, that's right. I took some therapy. The vagus nerve is basically the thing that regulates the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic system. And you want to be kind of in the middle overall, generally. And when you when you chill out and eventually go to sleep, you're in the parasympathetic mode, and when you're being chased by the bad guy down the street, you're in the sympathetic mode. But you want to be kind of in the middle overall and be able to go in either direction. So I took this vagus nerve stimulation, and I was monitored for just before it started. What was my average stimulation in between these two zones, all kinds of measurements, and I was way too far in the overstimulated mode. And then many months later, I was measured again, and I'd gone in the right direction, but not enough. And I think, even now compared to a couple of months ago, I'm in a good zone of, being able to adjust one way or another. But when you can spot people, by the way, when you see people that are all wound up, especially in relation to, whatever the stimulus is, you can just see them go into that like overly high-powered state where they're, things have to be done my way really fast. And maybe after 5 minutes, they're all calm, but they just went into that zone where they're not really being, regulated properly.
Yeah, because when we think of mental health, we tend to focus on the cognitive,
Right.
the thought patterns, the thinking positive, or however you want to spin 100 different
Right.
things. But we're only now, like I think, cluing into the fact that it actually lives in our nervous system physically.
Right. And in fact, all this stuff about the brain is actually kind of silly because the brain is part of the nervous system, which goes over the whole body. And by the way, this thing here is really powerful, the heart. And it's interesting how, top athletes can regulate their heartbeat because they know something's coming up in 5 minutes. They're going to be really chill now, And same thing with, trained military people. They can, regulate this. And in fact, there's this thing about there's the three brains. There's this brain up here, and there's this brain, and then there's the brain in the gut, which creates a lot of neurotransmitters which float around through the whole system. So, and in fact, the part of the brain that we use for thinking, so-called, the cerebral cortex, is only like a couple of cells deep. So we're this great big living system. And there's all kinds of discoveries in recent years about electrical fields that go through the whole body. And like photonic transmission, the cells talk to each other by spitting out little photons and the messages going back and forth. So there's all this stuff. So just thinking of ourselves as like little rational computers sitting up here is really very naive and out of date.
Yeah, because and going back to an instance that I talked about earlier where you were helpful in my life, there was a period in my life where I'd be doing the things. I'd be meditating, I'd be walking, I'd be trying to watch my diet, and I'd be doing all the things, and you'd be in a calm kind of environment, but your nervous system is still firing up. The anxiety is still through the roof. Yes. And you introduced me actually to a naturopath. Who was really helpful with me in that they looked into it and said, you can do all the cognitive things you like, but until you address what's going on physically, you're not going to get the momentum that you need.
Oh yeah, so here's a really weird story. One of these periods I went through with many family crises, I was down on the waterfront late afternoon doing something or other, and I knew a Chinese lady that had a tea shop across the street from where I was. And I just kind of wandered over there because I was just pacing around, difficult times. And I went over and had a cup of tea. And she said, by the way, David, we have this really good acupuncturist who's trained in China, and he's starting to do some work here, and he'll have some time at 7 p.m. after we close the shop. Would you like to try it? And I said, sure, okay. I didn't really have an opinion either way. So I came back at 7 o'clock, and I was pretty wound up from all this, family stuff going on. And so this guy talks really calmly, and I forget where he was from, but he was trained in China. He was Chinese, and his father ran an acupuncture school. So he was like top trained guy. And so I'm lying on a cot in the back of this tea shop, and there's a, barrier. And this guy comes in, he's talking really calmly, and he starts putting these little tiny needles in my arms and things. And I'm thinking, this, it's supposed to reduce stress. And I'm thinking, how can I be not stressed when I got these little tiny needles sticking out of everywhere? I was like, physically, this doesn't make any sense. And before I knew it, I fell asleep. I went from pissed off at the little needles and the bullshit to being asleep. And I can still remember that as a life-changing moment. And I went to this guy on and off for years for different reasons. He helped me actually when I had some issues with my left leg. But, I just remember how funny it was. I'm not happy and life really sucks. And all of a sudden I'm asleep. So whatever the mechanisms in the background, it works.
Working physically on the nervous system.
Right.
Because it's almost like it becomes inflamed, for lack of
Yes.
a better word.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
like an inflammation, would you think?
Right. And yes, and in fact, that's a big cause of many kinds of illnesses, including mental illness, is just general inflammation all over the place, which you can get triggered by physical stuff, triggered by allergies, triggered by stress.
Diet.
Right. If
Yeah.
I went off dairy a long time ago. I had a bunch of problems, and I had a great doctor, but nobody could quite figure it out. And I went to see somebody, like alternative medicine person, and she goes, okay, well, I don't know, David, but can I just do a little blood sample? And she goes, oh yeah. She said, you can't tolerate dairy. That's what she said. She didn't say allergy or whatever. She said, you just can't tolerate dairy. So I just went off dairy 100%. And 2 days later, all these little aggravating, difficult physical symptoms just started to fade out. And after 4 days, they were basically gone. And I've been in this state of, drinking milk and all that stuff that we just love and getting indigestion, but not clicking it. I think that's a really, really, common one. And now I can have, like a little bit of cooked cheese and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But if I had a glass of milk, I'd be pretty freaking sick. And so is it hard not to drink milk and everything? No, it's not hard, because you're getting all these benefits.
And you get used to it.
Right.
You come to enjoy your alternatives. Because dairy was
Right.
one for me as well.
Yeah. It's very, very common. And there's a lot of foods that are, people have, the allergies and intolerances and all that sort of stuff, which causes inflammation. And then, you sort of notice the secondary effects.
And then, of course, refined sugar,
Which is in a lot of stuff, by the way.
which is in a lot of stuff. It's hard to avoid.
The so-called standard American diet, SAD, there's a lot of sugar and there's a lot of salt. And that's interesting because, out in nature, you didn't get too many foods that were very sweet. So you want to consume them because they're not too much around. And same thing with salt. You need salt, but you're not necessarily going to get very much of it. So we're programmed by nature to crave that stuff. And then the food industry, or a certain part of it, is like, yeah, let's give this guy a shiny box with some nice sugar inside,
Yeah, sugar was a huge one for me. Like I started a fasting regime. I lost 80 pounds, but at the beginning of it, one of the things I gave up was sugar. And for the first 7 to 10 days, I hadn't realized this until I gave it up. But for the first 7 to 10 days, I looked like one of those heroin addicts that you see in the movies that was going cold turkey, sweating under a blanket.
Yeah.
And that really drove home the impact
Yeah. Yeah.
of sugar.
And there's a sort of hidden sugar. And I mean, I have a varied diet. I eat a lot of good stuff for sure, and don't really deny myself very much. But when you realize, just like a lot of orange juice is about 50% sugar, and you're giving it to some little kid, children are very susceptible to this stuff, by the way, and watching them get wired. And what I started doing quite a while ago is I would put just a little bit of juice in water for flavor. And I do guzzle water a lot, because I'm actually quite physically active and I find it hard to sit down, for long periods of time. And this must be a comfortable setup because I'm happy to be here. Plus, you're saying interesting things.
So what are some of the things that have been most beneficial to you as you improved your mental health? Like what are some of the things you've done that have been the most beneficial, do you think?
So one interesting thing about regular exercise. So it's either a habit or it's not a habit. So this prep school that I went to, so for 3 semesters, it was like mandatory sports, and a lot of it was outdoors. And you weren't competing against people necessarily of your age. You were competing against people of your ability level. So it was kind of a level playing field, as they say. So if you were really good at this sport, you'd be at this level. And if you were really bad at this other sport, but you were playing it, you'd be down here. That was normal. But the idea was that every afternoon you did a couple hours of activity. And I realized that got programmed into my brain when I was a teenager. And also, but my family was active as well. We had a tennis court across the street. They were all kind of nature nuts, going to the beach and walking in the woods. And, that was normal on both sides of the family. But especially, those teenage years, I was kind of programmed just to get exercise almost every day. And then I certainly went through my periods of, hey, I'd like another bunch of beers, please. And, don't forget the pizza. I went through those periods for sure. But then I kind of went back into the, got to get some exercise, and I'm not going to have any beer because tomorrow I'm going to walk for 5 miles up some hills, which is fun, by the way. Once you get into the zone, it's not as hard as running up a hill when you're doing cross country and training in cross country. So it ain't a big deal. But I was reading the other day that one reason why, kids in private schools do well is they get exercise every afternoon, keeps your brain going, sleep better. And that's really boring advice.
Yeah, but it's a fundamental.
Right, and
move.
it becomes part of you. And one thing that I find hilarious, by the way, in some of the self-help stuff is like this 10-minute bullshit, where it's like every day find 10 minutes for yourself, or find 20 minutes for yourself. Well, that's approximately the same as 14 seconds. It's like nothing. But when you get in the zone where oh yeah, every day I have to like read some kind of book I'm interested in because I like to do that, and I'm going to get some exercise. So all this stuff where you think you can micromanage your day like some little spreadsheet. Like that's actually guaranteed not to work.
Yeah. Here's the 10-step morning routine that takes 3 hours. That
right.
kind of
and
stuff.
You're really tired after that, and a normal person would have a nap.
Yeah.
And maybe the guy that's running the podcast has like 18 assistants, so they can deal with the boring stuff.
Yeah, I heard from somebody not too long ago. They were just basically they said, look, throw this stuff out and just do a couple of things that work for you.
And so here's an interesting thing. So we were in Taiwan recently visiting our son, the jazz guitarist. And there's a lot of like old Chinese health traditions in Taiwan. And one of them is that like looking after the older people. So you'd often see like 3 people at a crowded intersection. There'd be like the middle-aged person or the younger person with the child, and then holding the arm of the grandparent. And you see the 3 of them moving at the speed of the child and the grandparent. And everybody would get out of their way because that was part of the culture, And you would see these older people in parks doing Tai Chi, these really slow, gradual exercises. That's very good for your nervous system. And I used to do it, and now I'm kind of getting back into it. Not hardcore weightlifting stuff, but, body weight and, Tai Chi that are part of these, Oriental traditions.
So, to our, as you know, I'm trying to reach an audience of men. Yeah. And what would you tell them about like therapy? Because a lot of times there's a resistance to go to therapy and talk about it.
Right. Okay. So what I say is over the years, I've gone to quite a few therapists of different types for different reasons, and they've all been helpful. This is the key thing. They've all been helpful. And here's a funny one. I got basically recommended I go to this psychologist who's a top psychologist in the neighborhood. And I was, hard to get an appointment with her firm, much less with her. But I got an appointment with her because, as my wife says, I tend to be lucky. So I walk in, and then there's this lady with this, vibe just coming out of her. You look at her, you start to calm down. And so I had 2 sessions with her, and I was supposed to have a third one. And she said, well, what I could do, David, is I can make you a cassette. It was in the days of cassettes that you can listen to, whenever you want to. And instead of this session, you can just have the cassette and take it home, and then, it'll make just for you. So she did. And I would go home and, dark room and a comfortable chair. And, she's taking you down the hypnosis road, which is not very complicated, with her beautiful, soothing voice. And I listened to it many, many times. And I didn't know that was a hypnotherapy tape. I didn't even know. All I knew was it was really great. And now I can't find it. It doesn't matter because it was a cassette. And then I had Dr. Brown, the family doctor who specialized in hypnotherapy later on. And just, quite a few different types of therapies that all, they were all positive. They were all good, yoga, breathing, whatever. And then, getting a bunch of hours with a psychiatrist at the young age of 71, back and forth. It was kind of online, but his assistant was with me. And it was just fascinating because, it's like, well, I've been dealing with, hardcore stuff for like 50 years, and I'm finally getting like major FaceTime with this guy who's great, who works out of his home. And, we're just like trading insights. And I thought, man, I'm lucky to, so now I'm waiting for like a prescription for like a cognitive behavioral therapist, which has been proven to work really great for, many years through this doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I find a ton of benefit in it. It's just great. I've always found value in a couple of ways. One, it's just somebody to talk to who's generally impartial in my life,
Yes.
to be a sounding board. And the other thing is it's a trained professional to bounce the work that I'm doing off of and say, what do you think of this thing I'm doing? Am I on track? Am I off track? Should I bother with this? What's your opinion?
Right. And here's an interesting thing, because I was talking to somebody recently who's been going down that path with a really good therapist. And the term that sort of popped into my mind is like the no bullshit term, because sometimes it's in person and sometimes it's online, whatever. But what this guy said to me is that, like, I can't bullshit this guy, because if I start saying these things that, I think are going to help me, or problems that I think I have, if he doesn't agree, he's just going to, he won't say no, but he won't really engage. But if I'm going down a path that he thinks is going to be good for me, then he'll support me. And after a bunch of these meetings, my friend said, that's the pattern. So, if I'm kind of going down the wrong path, he's not going to pound his fist and say that's wrong. He's just going to not say anything. And and he said, this guy's really good for me. This guy is really good. And I could tell in the first 5 minutes, how the conversation's going to go. So you got to find the person that's right for you.
You do. So you need to be prepared to change around a bit, because, that personal relationship, you just need to find that person that's right for you. So I'm always point I try to make to people is, if you haven't found that person, don't give up. Just find the next person and they might be the right fit.
Right. And also, like you say, for men. So I read something the other day from the construction industry, and they did some big survey. And because, there's construction boom going on now, and there's all these people in complicated trades that are trying to work together on complicated projects, time pressure, all that sort of stuff. And it is not a healthy environment. Like, just by being in that environment, you're going to be spiraling down, says Stan. So they did some big survey, and they found like half the people working in this field now, in this place, have mental health issues. So, they need some individual help, but also the whole freaking system ain't working, because you got, all the people in the trades, they're like athletes to me. They're smart and they're physical. They can do a lot. And if they're overloaded, after a while, it's like you can only be in so many battles and you're going to be a train wreck. So just the fact that this stuff is coming to light, it's like, don't just fix the person, but look at the environment in which the person is working. And if they can't handle it, let's change the environment.
Yeah, and on a personal level, find yourself systems or models that work. And don't focus so much on the goal or the solution.
Right.
Is that a fair statement, do you think?
Well, that just the spiral up or spiral down. And sometimes when things are going great in everybody's life, you're going to have a really bad day, or you're going to have a bunch of bad days, or a bunch of bad weeks. That's just going to happen, right? So also, being aware of that. And then when, things calm down a little bit, then it's like, oh yeah, now I can go back to, my old habit that I couldn't do. I can go back into it now. And you just learned something the hard way, but you did learn something.
Yeah, and don't be discouraged when you're not getting immediate results. Because one of my favorite memes that I see going around is a lot is that one that says, how people think recovery looks. And it's got the dot and the line with the arrow, and it just moves in a straight line. And then it says, how recovery and healing actually works. And it's got that squiggly line that goes backwards and forwards and down and up. And
right,
it's not
which is how creativity works. Yeah, so part of our society with our screens and all this superficial stuff is, things are supposed to be shiny and highly functional, and you don't have to do too much work and all that. And there's a real high bullshit factor there. And one of my kind of things is some people are just really athletic. They're just really freaking coordinated. And they might have a beer gut and, blah, blah, blah. But, try to show them a new sport, and a couple hours later, they're at a high level. They're just freaking athletic. And other people look great, and they go to the gym, and they got the abs and all that sort of stuff. But maybe they're actually, their body distribution could be a little bit better, and that they could, if they had 5 pounds of fat, they'd be healthier. They're not particularly athletic. I mean, I'm not particularly athletic, but it's not just what the person looks like, but what can they actually do? And the old idea, you want to be fit enough you can carry heavy groceries out of your car. I love that metaphor. It's kind of simple. Just
some basic level of fitness.
Right.
Even just a basic.
Right. And also enjoying doing stuff, if you're used to walking 10 miles and you go for a 1 mile walk, that ain't nothing. Or, I'll go kayaking and swimming. The water's really cold. I'm not a strong swimmer, but I like to swim. get out of the kayak and swim. But if you're used to getting in the water when it's really, really cold, as it starts to warm up a little bit, it's like, wow, this is awesome. As long as I'm 10 feet from shore where the tide just came over the hot rocks and I don't go out 5 feet, this is going to be great.
So to bring things back to the beginning of our discussion and where we opened, how do you think your experiences have changed your approach as a caregiver?
Okay, right. So I think I'm much more objective. And it's, use a military, once you've been in a lot of battles, you can size things up pretty quick if you're lucky enough to be alive. So when you have a lot of these experiences and, you can sort of see the trend, or you can see somebody's doing way worse than they were a week ago, and, somebody needs to do something, or gee, they're doing great. But, and people mock experience and they mock expertise now, like we're all supposed to be so freaking clever. But I mean, the experts, they do know a lot. And maybe there's, some discrepancy about planning or, something like that, but they still know a lot. There's a lot of expertise out there. Don't mock it and, and keep your eyes open, but you just get this sort of objectivity from experience,
So, as we're nearing the end of our time together here, if you could give our audience like one piece of advice or a thought to leave them with, or
okay,
what would it be?
Okay, so I spend a lot of time now. I mean, I'm still doing some work, writing stuff and projects, but, just go like, if you go on our front deck, just the fact that you're on our front deck, it's like, oh, there's another one of those eagles, and the tide is coming in, and there's a point where the tide comes in and the birds all of a sudden arrive, and actually the sound changes. All of a sudden you're this like, whoosh, and the birds arrive. And like 5 minutes ago, it wasn't happening. So your senses just tune in. So I think my answer would be like, find an environment in which your senses tune in, not just listening to really loud music or a fascinating podcast, but, like if you're sitting in a comfortable chair and you're outdoors and it's like, oh, what was that over there? And oh, the temperature's going up a little bit now. Like get into your senses, because like we are, the nervous system lives in the world, not just your little tiny cerebral cortex. So like get back into your senses. And it's interesting too, like say, you go to a bar, you drink a whole bunch of booze, music's really, really loud. Well, really what they're trying to do is like shut off your higher brain. And what you need is to just tune into your senses, and then that will balance out with all the cognitive stuff. So you don't need to drink some really tasty alcohol and listen to head-pounding music, like get out in the woods and, put your toe in the water or something really boring like that.
So get away from that artificial stimulation,
right,
and get into some stimulation in the real world.
Yes. And one little thing I'm going to add, because I do have the ability to tune into people, and people tell me stuff. And I ask myself, why the hell is it? And I got this, I call it the three question thing. If you're talking to somebody and you just ask them 3 questions, no matter who it is, and how are you doesn't count, by the way.
Okay.
But you just create this little thread. And all of a sudden, this person is telling you like some mind-bending thing. And in 5 minutes, you're going to learn a lot. And there's this, sort of transfer of information. But if you're going down the road, with your bucket of coffee, on a mission,
yeah,
everybody's just sort of a nuisance. But when you kind of open up to the world, or you'll notice something like we had a lot of foxes on our property, and some of them, like they were kind of like my friends. It's spooky. And I'd be coming back from like a swim, and I'd look behind me, and there was Mr. Fox following me, and he would stop, and then I'd go 30 feet and he'd go 30 feet. And he wasn't any kind of a threat. We were just sort of comfortable with each other. And, it's like that kind of magic happens when you're, in a certain zone.
So going for connection, I like the 3 questions. Yeah. Do you have like a 3 like kind of standard questions that you go to, or?
No, and that's very interesting, because the answer is really no. It's just like, but people speak with their eyes, with their posture, with their body language, and sometimes somebody just doesn't want to be connected with. Fine, that's great, but here's an example from just the other day. Where we live, there's these huge clam flats, 40-foot tide coming up and down, and these clam flats, very few professional clam diggers. It's such hard work. And basically there's this one guy who's out there all the time, like bending over, with a clam hack and, up and down all day long. Must be like the most fit guy around, just an amazing guy. And I talked to him the other day, and he was coming back with all these, big buckets of clams, and he looks like an athlete who lives in the woods. Like he's got this like wide stance and these like massive forearms, and like not all bulked up, but just like, trim and fit and strong at the same time, and with this alertness of a guy who lives on the clam flats. It's probably on some spectrum. So I'm talking to him, and the first thing I said, and he's very suspicious, and he said, what do you want? And then I go, oh, we live over there in that White House. I'm just going for a walk. And he goes, oh, that house, that's Mrs. Nelson's house, my wife's mother. And he said, yeah, I'm from the town where they lived. I grew up. I know all about those people. So as soon as we hit there, we made the freaking connection. So then I started asking about like digging clams, and he told me all this fascinating stuff. And he just looked so athletic and comfortable in his body. People that work with their hands, they got like large muscular hands and like big forearms and all that sort of stuff in this wide stance. And I thought, man, this guy's like some sort of a, top level athlete who's digging clams out there in the breeze and the wind. And, it's like, that's an extreme example of somebody who's living in the real world. But I said to him, he was so skeptical at first. And all I said was, yeah, we just moved over to that house over there. Bingo, that was what I needed to say. And he goes, oh, blah, blah, blah. And then he started telling me all this stuff.
Yeah, so it's sort of, take an interest, create a real connection.
Right. And sometimes it isn't going to happen. That's fine too.
Yeah. Awesome. David, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I really, really appreciated you sharing your experiences and having this conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Really enjoyed it also.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of In the Mental. Do us a favor. Likes make the world go round, so head over to our socials. Give us a like or a follow. You can find them in the chat box below. And of course, we'd love to have a subscribe. Really, really enjoyed my conversation with David here today. And I'm going to keep it going for a little while longer. So head over to our YouTube channel for a little extra conversation where we talk about probably some random things, as myself and David tend to do when we get together. Until next time, here's wishing you peace, happiness, and good mental health.
You've been listening to In the Mental. Check out our YouTube channel for some extra material with today's guest. And remember, this conversation is not a replacement for a qualified professional. So don't be afraid to get your ass to a doctor or a therapist. Until next time, stay healthy.